Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation with changemakers working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Trees. That's what we're going to talk about today. They were everywhere, and everywhere humans have gone, they've mowed them down to make tools, homes, fires, bridges, buildings, and even railroad tracks. Yes, the first railroads often ran on wooden rails, as my guest today explains in his classic book, A Forest Journey, The Role of Trees in the Fate of Civilization. Author John Perlin joins me to talk about the new edition of the book, which was first released in 1989. This new edition published by Patagonia. And yes, there is an environmental impact disclosure on the copyright page of his book. John is also the author of Let It Shine, the 6,000-year story of solar energy and other histories of solar technology. His writing is consistently surprising and illuminating. For example, A Forest Journey challenges many of our current assumptions about the advantages of peoples and nations. A Forest Journey made me rethink Jared Diamond's claims in Guns, Germs, and Steel. John makes a clear case that Northern Europe achieved global dominance largely on the basis of its access to vast forests that in other parts of the world had already been chopped down during antiquity. The largely barren Mediterranean basin, for example, used to be heavily forested. I could go on, but you should read this book. Let's venture into the history of trees, wood, and the axe. You can learn more about John at John Perlin. That's John-Perlin, P-E-R-L-I-N, johnperlin.com. Welcome to the show, John. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here.
You know, I listed a few things that wood has been used for in the introduction, but could you summarize wood's pivotal role in the development of civilization, if it's even possible to summarize?
Well, to summarize, is first of all, I like to say trees rather than wood, because 385 million years ago, you had the first true trees and the first true forest, and they took down the carbon dioxide and added the oxygen to a point where animals that were large could roam the earth, and that's where we began. Was the capability to have enough oxygen to metabolize. And so as a species, we would have never developed if not for the forest coming on the earth 385 million years ago. But then for civilization, for example, the Stone Age is really the Wood Age, because what transformed the Stone Age life was two things: wood fires, and two was providing handles for the stone tools, because with the handles, the stone tools would have never mounted to anything. As you know, I mean, I've tried it just as an experiment to take up a rock and hit something with it with no avail, but then put a handle to it, and you have a nasty tool to cut down the trees. And as we get into the Neolithic, which is the New Stone Age, every tool had a handle, and especially the axe, which allowed farmers to open up the land. Now, as far as civilization goes, which we actually call the Metal Ages, it's actually also the Wood Age, because without wood fuel, there would have been no capability to remove the ore from the rock, because only 5% of the metals come to us as pure metal. Most of the metal we have to extract at a very high flame, and the only way we could do that up to the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, was by charcoal, which is a derivative of wood. And so actually none of the more temperate areas of the world, like Europe, could have been settled without wood fires, which totally changed us from a non-lingual animal into the ability to talk because we could gather around and start telling tales. So very briefly, without wood fire, there would have been no civilization and there would have been no settlement except in the very warm areas.
You thank you. That really encapsulates what I took away from the book, which is it also created, the wood has created the setting in which our civilization evolved and exists
Right.
today.
Well, just to add a little color, 10,000 years ago, forests covered 57% of the Earth's surface. Now we've reduced that by 30%, and that began with the first civilized settlements, which was in in the Fertile Crescent, where the second chapter of my book begins.
You know, over the centuries, over the millennia, people have just clear-cut forests in in Crete, in Lebanon, in Greece, in Britain, in England. You cover all these. Have humans learned anything from these repeated environmental disasters?
Well, at certain times, certain people had a inkling. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the first story of massive deforestation, one of the participants, as he's floating down the raft with his buddy, his culprit, he looks at him and he says, "I think we've turned the cedar forest into a wasteland. What will our gods think of this?" And so you have the first development of an environmental ethic with the destruction of the great cedar forests above Mesopotamia.
Now, another fact that you start the book with, and I think that people fail to recognize or appreciate, is that the forests actually produce 40% of the precipitation on the planet. Can you talk a little about how they do that and how humanity has changed those patterns?
Well, for the longest time, until about 30 or 40 years ago, most people believed that all precipitation came from the evaporation of the oceans. But in the last decade, scientists have discovered that trees, through what's called evapotranspiration, you see, trees need to pump up water from the ground to the leaves, so the sunshine can work in what we call photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is basically a breakdown of the water plus parts of carbon dioxide to feed the tree.
Well, and I think you can see the impact of this in places like Greece, which just feels desolate and arid today because there are no longer the many trees that were there before humanity showed up.
Right. Well, what I was going to say was that the leaf only uses 3 or 4% of that water for the photosynthesis process, and the rest of the water goes out into the atmosphere, which when it condenses, it becomes rain. And also, what trees do also is they make better use of whatever rain comes, because, for example, with a fog, they'll intercept the fog and the water will come dribbling down. Also, when it rains, if you ever experience this, I've experienced this a lot. Actually, this is a practical part of my book, is that if you sit under a tree, you'll get less rain initially on you, but then after the storm leaves, you'll have a trickle down effect. So you have maybe 50% more of the rain intercepted by the leaves. And if you didn't have the leaves, the water would just dribble down, would rush as torrents and erode the area. And that's exactly what happened in Greece, as you suggest, is whatever rainfall they got, they did not have anything to, you might say, catch it, and actually produce 50% more water.
Now, you also just touched on one of the other huge visible consequences of deforestation, which is the loss of soil, which ends up filling bays. And you show through maps how many bays around the world have been filled with silt, and what were port cities like Troy are now miles from the shore. How does that happen, and do you see it happening today around the world?
Well, actually, glad you mentioned Troy, because I spent 2 weeks camping by the ruins, and the ruins look like a beached ship commanding just mud. And you have to travel 7 miles to what's called Scamander Bay, where they believe is where the Greeks landed their ships. And also what happened, and this is how I really gain a visceral knowledge, is I always visit the spots I write about. I would go into the ruins before there was any watch, like 6 o'clock in the morning, and you could scoop out from the ruins all the shells, the seashells. So what happens is basically the once you denude an area, there is no protection against erosion. So when the rain comes down, it just grabs all that mud, all that dirt, puts it into the river. That dirt flows to where the ocean was, and creates what we call a delta, and just keeps building and building. For example, in Ephesus, over the centuries, was originally a port, and now is 13 miles inland, and that is a direct result of removing the protection provided by the trees.
One of the reading this, I was constantly reminded that history rhymes; it doesn't repeat. But there are so many stories of societal collapse related to the depletion of forests. Can you talk about what happened in Knossos, for instance, Easter Island, and how Islam failed to extend its dominance into the heart of Europe, and how trees played a common role in those stories?
Well, in Easter Island is very controversial, so I'm not going to go there.
Okay, sure.
But for example, to show you how it aids civilization, and then you can, and then see the converse, is that the silver mines in Lorient provided the wealth for the Greeks to build the ships that defeated the Persians at Salome, which actually made the difference between us speaking a Western language, you might say, or Persian. But to extract that silver, because it was an ore, as I mentioned earlier, it's only 3 or 4% was silver in the rock, created a wasteland in that area, which eventually, as Aristotle noticed, that the earth ended up just like the bones of a rotting animal, because there was no meat left because of the erosion. And so Greece, or Athens, I should say, became totally dependent on northern Greece, Macedonia, for its wood. And as we know, Alexander the Great came from Macedonia, right? And so he was able to take control because of the great woodlands of his empire. And the Romans actually realized this. And so when they conquered Macedonia, they made it a law that no one could cut down a tree.
That's another theme that runs through the story I want to get to in a few minutes. But as I read your book, I was constantly thinking of it in contrast with Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And guns, of course, include wood stocks. Germs don't travel without boats. Steel can't be made without wood. What is your sense of the relative importance in history of wood versus guns, germs, and steel?
Well, actually, wood is the basis of all the three that you mentioned. And that's really interesting because everybody's trying to find out, quote, the origins of COVID. But really, if you follow the air routes, you'll see that that's the route that COVID took, right, to infect. So had we banned airline, had we never had airplanes, the COVID pandemic probably at least would have been a much slower affair. And the same thing happened with the bubonic plague. Like you say, it traveled on wooden ships from the Far East. And so that's actually, I'm really happy about the question because that creates another idea in my head that 95% of all ships until that fateful battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor in 1861 were all built with wood. We could have never crossed the Atlantic if we didn't have wood. In fact, it was the discovery of the great woods of the island of Madeira that permitted Christopher Columbus and his group to build the super ships that they had. And one of the great discoveries of that a plethora of big trees provided was the crow's nest. So no longer were sailors had to be, for security, had to follow close to the coastline. They could go further and further out because they had a better view. So here we see and then the bubonic plague, like I said, traveled on ship, right, from China to Europe. It began, I believe, in Sicily, because that was the big entrepot from the east. And so there you go. And also the other interesting thing that I learned was that trees provide the social distancing for us to avoid many of the terrible diseases that the world has suffered.
How so?
Well, you take Lyme disease, for example. Lyme disease was created by the fragmentation of the forests in the New England area for, building subdivisions. So what happened was in the forest, you have specialized predators that keep the generalized animals at a minimum. And they are the ones that are the reservoir for the Lyme tick. And so once we removed the forest or fragmented the forest, all the predators, the specialized animals, became extinct. And that gave for a great explosion of the reservoir for Lyme disease. We could go to malaria as another example in, say, Brazil, where the forests provide a social distance from keeping down the mosquitoes that spread malaria. Once we remove the forest, then the mosquitoes, could do their thing. And there's good evidence that all the coronaviruses, we don't know, we're not positive about the latest coronavirus, but all the other coronaviruses have been spread by bats. And bats are another example of a generalized animal that was kept in the forest. But once we removed the forest, all the predators died. But the bats, they spread joyfully because the farmers' lights would attract insects, which is their food. And so you would have, once again, the mesh of people with the spreaders of coronavirus.
It is such an important illustration of the benefits of biodiversity. It both protects and helps us produce this wealth that we're talking about. John, I want to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be
Sure.
right back. And we are back to talk more with author John Perlin of A Forest Journey, The Role of Trees in the Fate of Civilization. John, your story is not all about destruction, although there's a lot of destruction in the book, but repeatedly, people have embraced this idea of conservation, but it often seems to be about the necessity to ensure future harvests of trees and wood. Do you see a practice evolving in the modern world of actually conserving nature for nature's sake to create that kind of buffer that you were just talking about before the break?
Well, I wouldn't say for nature's sake, I would say for humanity's sake.
Okay.
Because without water, it becomes very difficult to survive. And not only do the trees generate, drinkable water, but also they serve as a relay from distant forests all the way to areas that need water. As an example, the rainforests of the Congo relay water all the way to the Nile, and 40% of the water from the Nile comes from the export, you might say, of water from the Congo leaves. And it's and that's the hope of this book, is that people will see that science shows that trees and keeping the forest is basically keeping us alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these environmental services are referred to, which is a fairly sterile term, really represent a vast amount of wealth that's created for us simply by existing in this environment every year.
Well, one thing I learned from the book that I didn't feel it viscerally until I did this new edition. And I like to say the new edition has so much more material than I had in the original book. And I have to thank Patagonia for that, because they just allowed me to go wild, which I love to do. And the trees, basically, the trees are basically the guardians of a of biodiversity, and we are dependent on biodiversity. And somehow we've become, maybe it's biblical, I don't know, that God created man in God's image, and that we're different than the animals, but we are animals. Mm-hmm. And we are, like, as the COVID experience has shown, we are just as vulnerable to disease as any animal. I mean, look, 1 million died in so far from COVID in just our country. And that, I think that's greater than all the people dying in all the wars we ever fought. So we are animals, and we're vulnerable, and we need the trees as our ally.
You know, another story in the book that builds on that notion is how England, which came late to the global party, became an empire primarily based on its access to wood. How did England become a global power built on wood, and what does that tell us about where the U.S. is today?
Okay, well, England, in the reign of Henry VIII, was still a backwater country. Mm-hmm. Few ships, few industry, and you had an industrial revolution during the Elizabethan time. But that started to eat away at its forests. And I have to emphasize this, that never were all the forests ever depleted. And that was because it was not economically feasible to go more than 15 miles away from a river to access wood. because otherwise you would have to take it overland, and that was overly expensive for the economics. So there was a restrictive area where you could get wood, and where the forests by default remained. So once England started to become a power, and once again, it goes to the first question you asked: what do trees provide for civilization?
Right.
Well, they provided all the fuel for the iron industry, for the glass industry, and for many other industries. Once again, when you think of that gun, the wood stock required tree, and also the metal of the main device required tree. So what England did was, at first they went to Ireland, and it's hard to believe. I mean, do you think of Ireland as a greatly wooded, forested country? No,
No, not at all.
Right. It used to be a oak paradise, and what the English did, and this is why I could understand a Irish animosity to England, is they took all their forest and either used it for carrying materials, like, for example, a um, a, a beer barrel. I mean, no one would have their beer, right, if you didn't have wooden barrels, right? And also gave to the most important people in England the rights to smelt iron with the Irish wood. And once they ran out of that, as they came overseas in wooden ships across the Atlantic, they discovered a plethora of huge trees never seen before in New England. And it was a great gift to the British supremacy of the world, because they had access to the great white pines of New England. However, that created a problem because the people in New England wanted to sell the lumber, and the English wanted to conserve the trees so they could mast their ships. And this was the first, you might say, event that created a cleavage between the mother country and the newly arrived Americans.
That was one of the most interesting things for me, having read a lot of American history. It starts with free speech trials, John Peter Zenger's trial, for instance, but you never hear about the wood and the masts that you describe, because, and this is where price controls, England is such an encapsulation of this entire story. Price controls on wood and charcoal, restrictions on access to forests, and inflation led to British kings losing their heads and Britain losing the American colonies over wood in many cases. Are we beginning to repeat the same kinds of problems today in the way that we're trying to conserve what woodlands are left?
Well, actually, the scarcity of wood created the climate problem we're facing today, because once we started to run out of wood in England, for example, after 100 years of experimentation, we entered the fossil fuel age as a panacea to the scarcity of wood. For example, the scarcity of wood kept down the iron industry of England. We were producing not as much iron as during the Roman times, but once we discovered how to coke coal, in other words, how to make coal like charcoal, then we could start the Industrial Revolution. Because the one thing two things the Industrial Revolution requires is a plethora of fuel, and two is iron horse, right?
Yep. You've also written a lot about solar energy. Do you see us on the cusp of another great transformation at this point? Or how hopeful are you that we can move away from fossil fuels?
Well, that's the interesting thing is if we want to get is first of all, that's how I got into writing A Forest Journey, because I had just finished writing about the history of solar energy.
Mhm.
And over the thousands of years, the main reason people turn to the sun, for example, architecture, where in wintertime you could save fuel by using the heat of the sun if you properly oriented a building.
Mhm.
And so I discovered the reason why this happened, this solar architectural movement, whether it was in China, whether it was in Greece, whether it was in Rome, was because of a scarcity of wood. And so I asked myself, if these people are totally changing the way they build buildings, just because they didn't have enough wood, this would make a great story that no one had ever touched. And now we see the realization of it in this edition of A Forest Journey. And
It-
I'm answering a little obliquely,
Sure.
and then I will get to, can the sun save us? And we have a new way of capturing solar energy for electricity. And it's the most elegant way ever conceived. And that is it's the only quantum energy source based on the ideas of Albert Einstein,
Mhm.
where light is seen as a wave and as a particle. And those particles at a certain wavelength are able to move electrons in the solar cell to become, without any moving parts, with only the energy of the sun, not the heat of the sun, the
Mhm.
energy of the sun. And that's Einstein's great discovery, to simultaneously, without any noise, be converted into electricity from sunlight without any moving
Well,
parts.
if we can make that transition, do you envision a planet that can restore its forests to some level approaching what they were before? And do you see the dialogue about that changing as a result of what's going on now?
Well, there's so many special interest groups. That's the biggest problem. It's not the technology. The technology is with us right now and actually producing electricity cheaper than any other material on the earth, much cheaper than coal, cheaper than natural gas, much cheaper than nuclear energy, and might I add, a lot safer. But there's all these special interest groups like the big oil companies, for
Mhm.
example, which slows down the transition.
Mhm.
But yes, and also actually, it's kind of funny that I would write about both wood and solar energy, because you don't want shade when you're building a solar plant, but you don't have to chop down trees, because there's so many farmlands, for
Yeah.
example, that are no longer in use. And also, one of the beauties of the solar cell is you can modulate its size by how much electricity you want. So you can use rooftops where
Mhm.
you don't have to use large areas of land to produce the electricity.
Turning
And
back,
yeah,
well, go ahead.
no,
Please.
no, sorry.
Well, I want to turn back to the trees as we finish up this conversation. At the end of the book, you talk about the American experience, uh, Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, and so forth, and the rise of multinational forestry corporations, which made me really think about whether or not we can avoid a global deforestation crisis. Do you see us entering an era in which preserving the forests for their own sake, for all the reasons that we've talked about, is going to be a genuine policy discussion, or is it something that is already lost because of the economic incentives to continue to mow these things down?
Well, actually, I was reading yesterday about the forests of Gabon,
Hmm.
um, and the question they ask is the West or is the developed world willing to pay people to do nothing? This goes totally against the Protestant Puritan ethic, right?
Yeah.
The value of doing nothing. So if you pay people as much or more for doing nothing rather than being paid by, say, the a large timber company to acquire the timber, then we have hope. So we have to change our mindset that perhaps doing nothing and staying out of the forest is better than being a Paul Bunyan hero, right? And cutting down all the trees and then suffering, well, actually losing humanity. Because without the trees, we won't have the water, and without the trees, we'll trees sequester more carbon, for example, than all the carbon produced by vehicular traffic in the world. And we have to allow the trees. This is one thing people don't understand: is we have to let the trees grow. 50 or 60 or 70-year harvest just don't work. It's been scientifically shown that this idea of harvesting timber actually produces more carbon dioxide
Hmm.
um, that, than wood is not a renewable resource. We have to understand that. And so we have to let the trees, by doing nothing, uh, grow and grow and serve as carbon dioxide banks as we try to transition into a greener Earth.
So, John, if we can recognize the value of the environmental services that the forests provide us every year, and it runs into the trillions of dollars, do you think that we can develop a sustainable relationship with forests? And what would that look like? Do we need to go back uh, to 50% of the planet being forested? And how would we get there?
Well, actually, one example is Seattle, I believe, um, has mandated certain watersheds to be conserved
Yep.
to provide water for the city and pure water. And for example, in New York, also the city of New York, ironically, produces or provides to the city water that's purer than Perrier water. And that is because the city of New York has done exactly what I'm advocating. They looked at it very financial way. 9 billion to have a water filtration plants, or 1 billion to pay for the rights in the Hudson Hills to preserve the watersheds. And so basically, around the main human populated areas, this is actually a more profitable situation because, like I said, water is probably the most after the sky and the water are the two most important resources we have. We
Mhm.
need to breathe, we need to drink. But the problem with capitalism is they've always seen the water and the sky, and including the forest, as not a valuable asset to maintain. And so we have to change our thinking. We have to look at the air, we have to look at the water, and we have to look at the trees as our most valuable assets.
Well, John, I hope that people will take time to read your book because it really brings that message home that trees are absolutely essential. And I want to thank you for the time that you spent with us today. How can folks follow along with what you're doing now?
They can reach me through Patagonia. I love to answer questions, and I'll give you my email address, John Perlin, JOHNPERLIN, all lowercase, at UCSB for University of California, Santa Barbara.edu. I'd love to answer anybody's inquiries and continue the conversation maybe with you again, but read the book because it's a product of maybe 40 years of painstaking but joyful research, because I go out from about 6 blocks from my house is a wild area, and I just, it's like taking in sunlight, taking in the forest.
John, I thank you first for sharing your email address. That's very generous of you, and we'll include it in the article. But thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I hope we do come back and talk more about solar energy in particular.
I'd love to, because actually I have a paperback that's just out called Let It Shine, the 6,000-year story of solar energy, which tells the entire story of solar energy from ancient Chinese times all the way to the present.
Well, then we'll include a link to that too. Thank you very much for your time today, John.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
We've been speaking with John Perlin, author of A Forest Journey, The Role of Trees in the Fate of Civilization, which was just republished in a beautifully illustrated and expanded edition by Patagonia. You can learn more about John at John-Perlin, Perlin, john-perlin.com, and we'll include links to his books with the podcast. A short conversation cannot do justice to a book that covers the entirety of human history and millions of years of prehistory. A Forest Journey will change your thinking, and I urge you to read it. John's comments about how forests deliver unmeasured value through biodiversity, by buffering human and wildlife interfaces, and what we refer to as environmental services provided by nature are essential to understanding how we can achieve the turn to a sustainable economy. He says the value of doing nothing is what we need to acknowledge. And that doesn't suggest giving away revenue to people who are just sitting around. It finally recognizes that protecting nature ensures that the planet will continue to hand over trillions of dollars of resources each year. But a 2014 study in the journal Global Environmental Change estimates that due to poor land use, the topic we have been discussing, we've already cost humans up to $4.3 trillion in lost value each year. Preserving the forests is literally a way to get a free handout from nature. Recognizing that a healthy old growth forest creates precipitation, oxygen, access to biological discoveries, and so much more makes clear the value of preserving them. And that's a story that we need to shout from the rooftops and from the tops of trees. And you can help by sharing this podcast and any of the more than 380 interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear. If you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would be great. It helps people find us. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we can create less waste and create a sustainable society. Tell your friends, family, your coworkers that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Thank you so much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we're going to be back soon with another innovator interview. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.